Today we're going to be discussing a sikha, a lecture from the Lubavitcher Rebbe on the Torah portion of Mishpatim. And this lecture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe is a interesting lecture because it connects a lot of information that we have in the past, the previous Torah portion, and it also explains a Rashi that's a little hard to understand in the beginning of this week's parsha. And it discusses something that we touched upon yesterday as well, which is the idea of having laws about slaves right after the revelation at Sinai. So last week we spoke about the revelation at Sinai, and this week we begin talking about a slave, a Jewish slave that's a slave for 6 years. And he is freed on the 7th year, that you're not allowed to work him for more than 6 years. And we had a very interesting insight yesterday from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Alav Shalom. And today we're going to find another interesting connection between that law and the previous, in the Ten Commandments, the previous parsha.
I can't get my picture.
So in order to enjoy this lecture, we need to really know the Chumash and the Rashi a little. So I'm going to start off with the beginning, at the beginning of the Torah portion, and just get you a little, get the information, get it clear. So the beginning of the Torah portion mentions that these are the laws that you should place before them, and Hashem is telling Moshe to place the laws, monetary laws, and so on. Many of the laws in this week's parsha, there are numerous laws, and Hashem tells Moshe to place it before them. And these are, of course, all given at Sinai, and that's why it has the letter Vav, because it's a continuation. The letter Vav means and these. In other words, just like the previous things were from Sinai, these were also mentioned. These were also mentioned at Har Sinai, given to Moshe, and Hashem tells Moshe to put it before them, which means make it clear. Teach it to them a few times. It's not enough, twice or 3 times, but you got to make it very clear. It should be fluent. And you got to put these laws before them, which also means before the Jewish courts and not before non-Jewish courts. You're obligated, if you have a lawsuit with another Jew, you're obligated to bring it before a Jewish court and not a Goyish court, which means that it's an embarrassment to Hashem if 2 Jews are arguing, if they go to a American court. That would be an embarrassment to Hashem, because we have judges that judge according to the laws of the Torah, and this would be an honor to Hashem that we let Hashem's laws rule. And if we go to a non-Jewish court, it's sort of desecrating Hashem. Even if they would judge the same laws, even if they would say the same thing, but still, why are you going to a Goyish court to decide your decisions? Let's follow. Let's go and give the honor to the Jewish court, to Hashem and His laws, and so that's what it means. Lifneihem, put it before them, means before the Jewish courts. Otherwise, you're mechalel Hashem. You're desecrating Hashem's name. Now, the next law in the next verse jumps right into when you will buy a Eved Ivri. Now, what is an Eved Ivri? So Rashi starts out that this is a Jewish slave. When you will buy a Jewish slave, and Rashi is, after he mentions that it's talking about a Jewish slave, he questions that and says, maybe it really is talking about a non-Jewish slave that was owned by a Jew, an Eved of an Ivri, of a Jew. So Eved Ivri could mean 2 things, Rashi's telling us. It could either mean a Jewish slave or a non-Jewish slave that's owned by a Jew. Could be a Eved Kanani, it's called, a non-Jewish slave that's owned by a Jew. Maybe that's what it means. When you buy a non-Jewish slave, you can only work him for 6 years. And Rashi says, but you know what? It can't mean that. And before Rashi says it can't mean that, he says, how can I even think of this idea that an Eved Ivri means a non-Jewish slave that you would have to let go of after 6 years? There's a verse that says that you inherit a non-Jewish slave to your children. So what do I mean? You have to get rid of him after 6 years? The Torah talks about even inheriting, even the inheritance that the slaves are inherited. Sounds like you have them forever. And Rashi says, well, that verse would be talking about when you buy him from a non-Jew, maybe. But if you bought him from a Jew, maybe then is when you have to get rid of him after 6 years. You have to free him after 6 years. And Rashi says, but you know what? It has to be talking about an Eved Ivri. And that's the final conclusion of Rashi. He says, because it says, when your Jewish brother sells himself to you. So it says your Jewish brother, obviously it means, or when your Jewish brother is sold to you. So we see clearly that it means he's your brother. So it must be a Jewish slave. So again, Rashi's bothered with the fact that it's unclear. Eved Ivri could either mean a Jewish slave or a slave of a Jew, a non-Jewish slave of a Jew. And Rashi concludes that it means a Jewish slave. And Rashi says that Rashi continues and he says, when you will buy him, it means that the court sells him and he's not just selling himself because he's poor, but the court is selling him because he stole. He stole and he did not have money to pay back. So he is being sold by the court, and the person can buy him for six years. It has to free him at the end of 6 years. And then it talks about it talks about other technical laws about a slave, about this Jewish slave. After it finishes talking about the slave, it mentions an interesting thing. It says, what happens after 6 years if he wants to stay? He wants to continue working for you. He says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, which means that he is given, when he's a slave, there's unique laws that apply to him, that the Jewish slave is allowed to be given a maidservant to marry. Very interesting laws that if he's a Jewish slave, certain technical rules have to fit. Has to fit all the technical laws. But he is given a wife to marry, who's a maidservant, and the children and the wife stay as maidservants even after he leaves. They stay. But what happens if he says, I love my wife and my children, I want to stay being a slave? So then it says that we pierce his ear. The master pierces his ear with an awl, and he becomes a slave until the Jubilee year. And so that's in the commentaries. Rashi brings down the Talmudic commentaries that talk about the fact that he stole and he didn't listen to what was said at Mount Sinai, don't steal. So therefore his ear gets pierced. And another point is, at Mount Sinai, he was told that you're a slave to Hashem and not to anyone else, and you want to become a slave to someone else, your ear should get pierced. And then there's another interesting point that it's where is the ear pierced? Near the door and the doorpost. And why over there? Because the doorposts and the door were witnesses in Egypt when Hashem passed over. And Hashem said, you are my slaves and not slaves to other slaves. And this man goes and purchases an owner for himself. His ears should get pierced before the doorpost and the door, which which means they are witnesses, so to speak, that saw Hashem passing over, that Hashem is choosing us as his slaves, and someone goes and buys himself another master, that the person deserves to be, his ear should get pierced in front of them. So this is the general picture. And then the next verse talks about if a person sells his daughter as a maidservant, and what ends up happening is she is under a certain age, because once she becomes 12, she is freed. So, but if she's sold as a maidservant, the owner or the owner's son can marry her, and the money that was paid for her to be a maidservant ends up being the money that he pays the daughter, is almost like the ring that he gives for marriage. And so this is the next portion that the Torah talks about, and it mentions, of course, that she becomes like a regular wife. He's responsible to give her clothing, food, and time, and a relationship, and he's not allowed to. If he is not interested in marrying her, he's not allowed to sell her as another slave maidservant. But that's it. The father can't sell her, and the master can't sell her, and that's the law of the Hebrew maidservant. The father who sells his daughter as a maidservant, maybe because he's going to sell her to a wealthier family, and maybe that she should eventually marry a member of that family, but of course she's coming from a very poor family, so the father is selling her to this wealthy family, and that's basically the law that comes right after the law of the Jewish servant, is the law of the female, the maidservant, who is sold. So that gives us a little picture of the beginning of the Torah portion. Now, the discussion that we're going to enter now is a discussion of the Rashi that deals with, is this a Jewish slave or is this a non-Jewish slave?
Rabbi?
So think about what we're talking about here. The Jewish people just left Egypt. We got the revelation at Sinai, and think about how we left Egypt with a lot of wealth. And now the Torah jumps to this idea of a Jewish slave. Does that sound surprising to anyone?
No.
Yes, Andrea.
Yeah, I think it's very surprising. We're all supposed to be free. I mean, maybe because we were slaves and, it's a mindset in a sense, and maybe there needs to be some kind of hierarchy, and people, but we're not going anywhere. We haven't gotten to where we're going yet, so everybody should be free, right, and equal.
Okay, that's a very good point. To just think about, just practically speaking, we should all be free.
On the other hand, Rabbi,
yes,
it seems to me that it would take the 40 years in the Midbar to eliminate the vestiges of the slave mentality. And therefore, they still had a slave mentality.
Okay.
So it's not surprising to me that they would accept the yoke of ownership, but from another Jew or from an Israel. The thing I wanted to ask before was if the maidservant given to them as a wife was old Jewish.
I heard the first thing you said. Let me just touch upon that. maybe later you'll discuss. I know you're asking something about a maidservant, but I couldn't hear you clearly. But let's just touch upon what you, because the discussion is not mainly about the maidservant anyway. But maybe you'll hold that for later. Maybe right after the class we'll talk about the maidservant. Maybe I'll somehow be able to hear you a little clearer. The point you're making is a very interesting point that you're making about the Jewish slave, and that is that the Jewish people maybe had this mindset of being enslaved. And maybe that's why a Jew might want to enslave himself, is because he can't really get the slave mentality out of him. So that's an interesting thought, which we're not going to be talking about. It's not part of the Rebbe's discussion, but it definitely is an interesting, it is an interesting thought that, you know, would that be something normal for someone who gets freed, that they would ask someone to buy them as a slave? You know, would that make sense? In other words, I understand they think about getting everything free and so on. You know, a slave mentality is give me everything and I'll work for you, and you provide, you know, I shouldn't have any obligations of my own. All the obligations are on you. I just follow whatever you say. So would people want to do that after being enslaved for 210 years in Egypt? Is that the meaning of enslavement? I'm not really sure. It's an interesting thought, Phyllis. Very interesting. You know, would that be part of the slave mentality or not? Maybe slave mentality means that, you know, you have certain issues, certain things, hang-ups, but I don't know that you would want to initiate that you want to be a slave now. Yes, Andrea.
When we were let out of Egypt and we had all of Egypt's riches, how was it divided? Does everybody have a share? Is it in one big, a few big chests? I mean, you know, how are we all got something so we don't need to go sell our daughters or whatever? I mean, and we didn't know how long we were going to be in the desert. You know, we were free, without really knowing what was going to come ahead.
Right.
I think
that you're touching on a very good point, Andrea. Very, very well said. That how wealthy were the Jews at this time? Because when you talk about slaves, you know, now I will take that a step further. What type of slave are we talking about when we talk about a Jewish slave? What did he do? How did he become a slave? What did he do wrong? He stole. So we're talking about a guy who stole. And what makes him a slave? Why does he become a slave if he stole? Let him pay back what he owes. And the answer is because we're talking about a slave that stole and has no money.
Right.
So think about that. We're talking about a slave. Why is he a slave?
Right.
He's a Jewish slave because he stole and he has no money to pay back. So we make him, the court sells him as a slave and takes the money that he's being sold for as a slave and pays back the debt that this guy owes the people who he stole from. So do the Jewish people have money at this point? Would they steal? Would it make sense that they would steal? And would it make sense that they have no money to pay back? So this is very connected to the fact that we're discussing this law right after they left Egypt. So it's great, very good point, Andrea. Yes, Ben. Ben.
I wanted to answer your first question, but now I'll answer those two women. The laws of the Torah are not temporary. They are not just for the generation that came out of slavery. They are laws forever. And only the people that came out of Egypt only live in the desert for that generation, and that's it. But anyhow, your other question was why he starts with a Jewish slave. And most of the laws are about working the land and how to treat the land and so forth. But before you worry about the land, you have to worry about the brethren. You have to worry about the human beings, not to mistreat them. And that's why the slave, which is a human being and Jewish, and that's who you have to worry about first.
Uh-huh. Okay, that's an interesting thought. So Ben wants to say that maybe because the Torah is eternal, so it's not surprising that the Torah talks about the laws of a slave, even though maybe they don't really apply now, because the Torah is eternal. But the question you could ask on that is that even though the Torah is eternal, but it would be nice to start with things that are practical and then talk about things that are not so applicable. Because these are, they don't really apply now. If something doesn't apply at all, let's push it off for later. Let's talk about things that are more important for right now. And we have many laws that applied right away. So even though the Torah is eternal, it would seem like maybe we should talk about the, things that are more practical. So we've got a lot of interesting ideas going on here and thoughts about the fact that this law is coming to us right after the revelation at Sinai. Now I'm getting a text over here, and I'm not so familiar how to use these things, but it says Ezra has a question. I don't know how I would see that, but okay. Ezra, do you have a question?
Well, no, I was going to say the same thing that Ben said.
About eternal.
That the Torah doesn't only apply, when they were in the desert, but also when they conquer Eretz Yisrael and they become settled there, and the Jewish people go about their normal everyday business. Not everyone is going to have, money and the land itself, because it's not going to be the same everywhere. It's possible that people who get pieces of land may have a piece of land that is not arable and does not produce as well, and so perhaps somebody might then try and take into his own hands by doing something that would cause him to be caught for stealing and then sold in order to repay whatever whatever they have to pay. And again, the important thing here is that we have to remember that you're going to be a nation of Jews, and if one of these Jews, perhaps more than one, is sold into slavery, how do you handle, or how do you deal with that individual? And so here you're being told this at this point to remind you, yes, now you're a free nation, but also remember what your roots are and where you came from. And just like you didn't want, or you didn't appreciate the way the Egyptians dealt with you, you should not deal with your own brother.
Okay, the only thing is that it doesn't really tell us so clearly here about how nice you should treat this Jewish slave. It just says that you got to let him go free after 7 years. So I don't know if the emphasis is how to treat him here. It's more telling you what your response, what your ability is with regard to having him having him impregnate a maidservant to be able to have more slaves, being allowed to keep him after the 7 years if you want, but officially it's only 7 years, and it sort of stops there. I mean, it's not really telling us that much.
Rabbi, in the next, it basically says, when the 7th year comes around, you have to let him go, and he has to be free. So in other words, you can't say, oh, yeah, the law says he has to be free, so therefore I let him go, but I saddle him with all kinds of things because he hasn't completely paid or paid off his debt. That's number one. Number two, it says anything that he's brought in, all right, he can take out with him, you know. Which basically means, you know, you can't confiscate everything that he had when he comes in to work for you for those 6 years. You know, you have to treat his things as being his things. And yes, there is a, you know, there's an entire, I mean, there's a Gemara that talks about exactly how you have to treat, or even Rashi tells you that, you have to treat him better than you treat your own family members.
Right. I just don't see it here. Again, I'm not disagreeing with the laws that we treat the servants well. Again, you're right about these things. The only question is, do you see that here? See, the translation of Begapo Yavo, Begapo Yetze is that if he came without not being married, then you're not allowed to let him, he's not allowed to marry a shifcha, a non-Jewish maidservant. But if he came married, then he is allowed. That's what it means, Begapo Yavo, Begapo Yetze. Now, so in other words, at least on the simple level, it's not really telling us that much about the laws of, you know, giving him a bonus when he leaves, and you know, how you treat him when he's a servant. I don't see that here in the verses here. You're right about it, that we do treat them very well, but it doesn't seem like it's emphasizing that as the purpose of saying this, you know, over here. So that's where I'm coming from. And at least, and again, you're not wrong. It's just not, I don't see it being emphasized. So the question is, so what are we emphasizing here? Why are we mentioning this here? And then about the fact that the Torah is eternal, and you know, it could apply later on. That's true for sure. The only question is this where do we need to mention it now when there are other laws that apply now? So, you know, so these are good idea, good thoughts. We're coming up with great thoughts of possibly, you know, this could be a reason why it's here, and maybe there are other reasons that, you know, that will allow Rabbi, it to fit in better. Yes.
Rabbi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. The Shifcha Ivrit marries her master.
A Shifcha Kananis.
The offspring are, you're saying they're slaves also?
Shifcha Kananit. It's not a Shifcha Ivris. This Shifcha Kananis marries the Eved Ivri.
No. He marries the master, her master. Her
master.
It's the Jewish woman, Jewish slave who marries the master.
The female.
I was talking about the Amma Ha'ivriya. Okay, the Amma Ha'ivriya. She's not called the Shifcha. She's called an Amma. Amma Ha'ivriya marries the master or the master's son. Is that what you're referring to?
Right, and you're telling me
the
offspring are slaves?
No, that I wasn't telling you that. I was talking about the Eved Ivri marries a Shifcha Kananis. The offspring stay slaves.
Oh, I see. Okay, I understand. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Ben, did you want to say something? Ben.
Yeah, I wanted to say I thought that this is just the beginning of the laws for slavery. There is more developed later, I thought, in the Torah, where when he leaves, you have to give him some money too.
Right, exactly. Right.
To be able to get somewhere.
Right, Hanit Tanakla. Again, that's right.
So I don't know that everything is right here in the first couple lines.
Right. So the question is, so why does this belong here if it's not mentioning, you know, it's not emphasizing how nice we are to the Jewish slaves, you know? So that sort of adds to the question. Why is this mentioned here? So it's a good point. Good point, Ben.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Yeah, I think just to clarify, she can correct me if I'm wrong, but Phyllis, I think, was trying to ask, with this Jewish male slave, that he's being married off by his owner, by his temporary owner. Is he being married off to a Jewish slave or a non-Jewish slave? That is the male.
Is that what she was asking? Okay, I couldn't hear it.
She was being. She asked, is the female Jewish or non-Jewish that's being married off to this
Thank
male
you,
slave?
David. Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Okay, yeah. I don't know why it was so unclear. the answer is that
I wanted to say something about
just 1 second, Ben. Just 1 second, Ben. The Jewish slave, Eved Ivri, he, believe it or not, is given a shifcha kananis, a non-Jewish slave to have children with. This is one example, one case, the exclusion to the general rule where no one is ever allowed to marry a shifcha, a non-Jewish maidservant, but an Eved Ivri is a exclusion to the rule. He is actually allowed to, and his master is given permission to give him a shifcha kananis, a non-Jewish maidservant, to marry the Eved Ivri and have slaves that will be considered slaves even after the father leaves, even after the father is freed. The slaves will stay as slaves, as non-Jewish slaves, Eved Canaan. Now, it's hard to say exactly call them non-Jewish because they do go through some type of a procedure, like a partial conversion, but we still call them an Eved Canaan. We do call them a non-Jewish servant, because they're not fully Gerim, they're not complete converts. They go through a partial conversion where they're obligated in certain of the commandments, but it's not a full-fledged conversion. They're not allowed to marry a Jew. And the only exception is this Eved Ivri, who for reasons beyond the scope of this lecture and maybe beyond the scope of understanding, is sort of one of those laws that we don't really know why, that Eved Ivri would be allowed to actually marry this shifcha, this maidservant.
I wanted to tell you why.
Yeah.
I wanted to tell you that we learned in Tanya too, you're not allowed to waste your seed.
Right.
So if he's going to be there for 6 years, maybe that's the reason that he's given a right to a wife.
Yeah, but the thing about not being allowed to waste your seed would be, it's even worse to a certain extent. In other words, it's harder to do tshuva by marrying a non-Jew than to just waste your seed. So wasting your seed is a terrible sin, but it's harder to.
But you said she's not dead. There is a procedure that she is. Usually the wife, originally the wives, none of them were Jewish, right? Abraham was a man.
Okay,
so
but
the wife always followed the man's religion. If you live together.
Yeah, but they were kept as children were kept as slaves.
It's an interesting thought. Let me just mute everyone. It's hard to hear. It's an interesting thought, Ben. Definitely very, very interesting. What your explanation, very innovative. I like it, but I'm not sure if it flows, and I'll tell you why. I'm not sure if it fits. It's a Jew is not allowed to marry a shifcha, even though she has some level of, a conversion that she's obligated in commandments, but she's still called a Canaanist. She's not called a Jew. And a Jew officially is not allowed to marry her. It's really considered, it's considered a biblical sin to marry a shifcha. And so the fact that there is an issue of, wasting seed, that would be just an obligation on him to, have pure thoughts. It's not a excuse for him to marry a shifcha and for the Torah to permit it. Maybe there's such a there is laws where it's someone called an Eshes Yefas Toyar, where there's a
That's
woman.
what I was going to say. Yeah.
But even there, it's
war. Yeah.
Even there, Eshes Yefas Toyar is a unique case, and the reason there is because it's impossible for the Jewish commander to control himself when he feels he captured this Eshes Yefas Toyar, this woman in the war. So the Torah speaks against his Yetzer Hara. But here, it's not clear that an Eved Ivri has such a strong Yetzer Hara that he wouldn't be able to control himself, just like anyone else who's not married. And we don't give them leniencies to go marry a non-Jew because they're not married. and we're afraid of them, their Yetzer Hara overcoming them. You get what I'm saying? So the Eishes Sifas Torah is an example, it is a case, but it seems. So again, I'm not really sure. A place to look this up would maybe be the Sefer HaChinuch. Maybe it would explain it there in the Sefer HaChinuch. So if we want to do homework, you could take a look in the Sefer HaChinuch, which is probably online in English. I don't know, but I'm guessing you might find some discussion about this. Why is an Eved Ivri allowed to marry a Shifcha? It's definitely an interesting question, and it wasn't really the point that I wanted to discuss at length, although it is interesting. So
Rabbi,
yes,
it occurs to me that there's an economic benefit here of producing additional slaves who would remain with the master. The children are not considered Jews, so
right.
He doesn't have to free them. And
right.
at the same time, the father is not wasting seed. It
right.
may not seem very humane in our terms. But
right. It's hard to say that an economic benefit would permit something that's prohibited in the Torah.
Agreed.
So that it doesn't really fit so well either.
But it's allowed apparently. I mean, that's what they're supposed to do, it seems.
Again, it's beyond our understanding at this point. And I don't see any explanation, from what we've said. I don't see any solid explanation to it. And it would be interesting to see if if Sefer HaChinuch explains it better, or maybe the Moira Nevuchim, but maybe there are some explanations to it. In any event, what we're going to do is now think about this Rashi, and Rashi over here mentions that the slave that we're talking about here is a Jewish slave, and then Rashi questions himself and says, maybe it's a non-Jewish slave. So why is Rashi questioning himself? Maybe it means a non-Jewish slave that's owned by a Jew. And the problem, the reason why it seems so obvious that it should mean a Jewish slave is because there is other verses in the Torah that use the same terminology. There's a verse in Divrei Hayamim in the Chronicles that says, Sheshan Eved Mitzri. Sheshan was an Egyptian Eved, Egyptian slave. And it doesn't mean he was a slave of an Egyptian. It means he was an Egyptian slave. There's no question about it. And there is another verse that says, Eved Li'ish Amaleki, a slave to a Amalek man. Now there it clearly spells it out, that if he's owned by someone, and it's talking about the person who owns him, it would say clearly an Eved to a Amalek man, an Eved to a Jewish man. That would mean he's an Eved non-Jewish slave who is a slave to a Jew owned by a Jew. So again, there are verses that seem to know how to clarify, it seems to be very clear what this means. Why are we questioning it here that we think that it must mean a non-Jewish slave? Why would we even have such a thought? It doesn't flow so well with the verse. It doesn't fit in well. And we have other verses that also say similar things, and they all mean the way the initial thought that we have, and that is that this is a Jewish slave. Everything seems to work by saying that, means an Eved Ivri. And so that's the first question. Another question is, why does Rashi say when you will buy an Eved Ivri? If Rashi is just telling us, why is the heading when you will buy a Jewish slave? Rashi should just say a Jewish slave means an Eved Ivri means a Jewish slave and not a slave owned by a Jew. A Jewish slave and not a non-Jewish slave owned by a Jew. Rashi should just translate that. Why does he make a heading when you will buy an Eved Ivri? Emphasizing about something about you buying. Like, what does that have to do with his translation? He's just talking about what is an Eved Ivri. Is it an Eved that's Jewish, a slave that's Jewish, or is it a non-Jewish slave owned by a Jew? So that's really the another question on Rashi, why he says those. Then comes another question on Rashi. Rashi says that what will I do with the verse, V'hisnachaltem oisam? The verse says, you will inherit your slaves to your children. Now, where does it say that verse? V'hisnachaltem, you will inherit these slaves to your children. That is in the book of Leviticus. So why is Rashi bothered with a verse from the book of Leviticus? We didn't learn it yet. So we don't need him to ask this question and come up with some answer if it doesn't really, it's not bothering me because I don't know Leviticus yet. I'm still in the book of Exodus. And because we haven't reached the book of Leviticus, it would make sense to ask this question when we come to the book of Leviticus, if there's a contradiction. Don't ask the question here because something we're going to learn later seems to contradict this. So that's another question that we have to understand, why Rashi brings a proof that a non-Jewish slave you keep for more than 6 years. He brings a proof and from a verse in Leviticus, and why should he be asking a question from that verse if we didn't study it yet? And so these are pretty strong, solid questions. And additionally, why does the Torah jump to this slave that's going to be obligated to work for 6 years? And why doesn't it start off telling us that you're not allowed to steal? And if you steal, you have to pay double. And if you pay double, if you don't have money, then you get sold as a slave. And then if you get sold as a slave, then it should mention our verse. In other words, it seems to skip out a number of laws. That is, number one, you have to pay double. Number two, there are certain cases where you have to pay 4 and 5. So it seems to skip out a lot of laws, and it doesn't mention it at all. So
they just mentioned it in the previous page.
It mentioned stealing. Don't steal. Lo signav, right?
What ignav? Yeah. Double, triple. It should tell us. Didn't tell us. Right. Actually, the most important thing it should say, v'nimkar b'gnei vasoy. He gets sold if he doesn't have money to pay. That would be the most apropos thing to say. And once it says that, I would say it should also say the laws of paying double and paying quadruple and 5 times as much, because that would be more of a reason why he wouldn't have money to pay. So these are all the questions on Rashi, and so in order to answer this, we need to understand that the problem that we have here is that we just read about the Jewish people leaving Egypt. And we know that they left Egypt with tremendous, tremendous wealth, right?
Yes.
Not only did they leave Egypt with wealth, it says when the sea split, the Egyptian chariots had gold and silver and precious gems attached to their chariots, and the Jewish people had to be pulled from the Yam Suf to keep on traveling because they didn't want to leave. There was so much booty from the sea that they wanted to grab as much as they can. They didn't want to move on, and Moshe had to push them and say, "We got to go. It's time to leave." And they said, no, we got the, here making this is a $5,000 diamond, and that's a bar of gold, $20,000, and this is it. They didn't want to leave. They got gold as wealth right in front of their eyes. And so Moshe had to pull them to leave. They had so much wealth. It says every Jew had many donkeys worth of kaspam and zahavam shel Mitzrayim. One source says 90 donkeys carrying silver and gold. So tremendous amount of wealth that they had. So once we see that they have all this wealth, what is most surprising here is the question that we touched upon earlier is, why is anyone going to steal?
That's right, yeah.
That's a good question.
And
I
if
was just
someone
asked that
steals,
question, so yeah. If they
What
have
is
all
that?
that wealth, why would they?
I can answer it, Rabbi.
yes, Ben, why would someone steal?
Rabbi, I want to answer that because we know from the lottery that most people cannot handle riches that come easy.
Uh-huh.
Within a short time, they are even worse off than they were before.
Right. So that goes good. That's a good point. The only thing is, just think about it. The Jewish people were traveling. They didn't have time to spend the money. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have the
carry the stuff.
You know, they didn't have anything to do with the money. They couldn't invest it. They couldn't gamble with it. There was no opportunity. There was nothing for them really to do. So in this situation,
they could buy donkeys.
Buy donkeys. Uh-huh.
Rabbi,
it doesn't seem like they had any.
There are 600,000 people walking.
What were they doing? Making deals with each other, gambling with each other? You know?
Sure, they could make deals.
It seems surprising that they were, you know, enjoying the spirituality, leaving Egypt and so on. Yes, someone had a question.
yes. Okay, the last of the Aseret Diborot says that you should, you know, lo tahmod.
Okay.
Right? So, okay, you have a lot, the other guy has a lot, but, you know, what's to say that you don't say to yourself, I wish I had his part too. So therefore...
Okay, so you're saying a person would be jealous?
Yes. You know,
even though...
you know, it's not, he's not Yaakov, who says, you know,
Rabbi.
Hashem blessed me with everything.
Okay.
You know, he might be more like an Esav who says, yes, you know, I have a lot, but I wouldn't mind having more.
Okay.
Rabbi.
So that's true. Good point.
Rabbi.
Yes, Moshe.
I just want to mention that, you know, with the Federal Reserve Board, you know, when a lot of currency is printed out and there's, you know, and there's nothing being produced and your money keeps being produced and everybody's got a lot of paper money, it's worthless. You know what I'm saying? So the possibility is even though it was, you know, everybody had, that may have diminished, you know, each person's value, you know.
Okay, I hear you. I'm sorry, I just muted everyone because there's too much background noise. I hear you, Moshe. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But I do want to just mention that, you know, there's two types of money. There's paper money that we have in the United States and other countries, and then there's gold, silver, diamonds. This is value. This is not just paper money. So there is you know, we're dealing with items of value that are valuable no matter where you take it, and therefore, you know, it doesn't have the same issues that we have here with the government, you know, printing trillions of dollars, and there's no way to back it. So it does seem like they did have some type of you know, they had tremendous wealth and it had value. And Ezra mentioned that they might be, you know, that people still are jealous. A person might have millions of dollars, but he still wants more. And it's not surprising if he will go and steal. Okay, that's true. There are definitely people out there that are, you know, they might be very wealthy and they'll still, they like, you know, they do like stealing. But the problem is that even if you want to say that, how does someone get sold as a slave? They have to steal. There's two things. They have to steal and use all their money, and then they have no money left. So this guy who maybe he was a multi-billionaire and he wants more, so he stole. Where did all the money go that he stole? Why doesn't he have that money to pay back? He's very wealthy. He has his own money and he has the new money that he stole. And why is someone stealing in the first place? And the fact that he is stealing, he should have money to pay back. In order to be sold as a slave, you have to be penniless. So therefore,
maybe they donated it to the Beis Hamikdash.
So they didn't get the command yet. They didn't yet get the command to build the Mishkan yet. So the fundraiser, there was no nonprofits yet. They didn't yet start the nonprofit organization, type of program to fundraise. The fundraising, the new type of work, the fundraisers. So the question is, so what is the meaning of this in this era, in this time frame of where it's being discussed? So now, if you think about it, if you turn if you look at last week's Torah portion, it is very interesting because at the end of the portion, after it talks about the 10 Commandments, then it does mention, don't make for me gods of silver and gold. Not for me. I said that wrong. Don't make with me. In other words, don't make forms of the sun and the moon and other entities that are in heaven. Don't make forms of gold and silver. Why is God saying that now? Because they all have a lot of gold and silver, right? And then it says, and I want you to make a mizbeach. It mentions building a altar of earth. That type of altar you will build, and you will bring sacrifices on a altar of earth, and an altar, a mizbeach, an altar of stones. So it sort of flows very well. We just spoke about the revelation at Sinai, and we just had the splitting of the sea, and you have so everything seems to flow, and all of a sudden now we talk about the laws of Mishpatim. Someone stealing. Here we're totally it totally doesn't flow. If we were talking about gold and silver, it makes sense. Something about here we're talking about someone stole and he doesn't have a penny to his name. It like jumps to a whole new league. So therefore we must say that Rashi therefore says, you know what? We're not talking about a Jewish slave. We must be talking about a Goyish slave, an Eved Kanani, a Jew. He's got 90 wagon loads. He's got 90 camel loads of donkey loads, of gold and silver. You know why Rashi says maybe we're talking about gold? We're talking about an Eved Kanani, because it can't be talking about an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave. Does that make sense? He stole. He has no money to pay. Doesn't make sense. So therefore, we're talking about the Jewish. Therefore, we're talking about the Jewish. Therefore, we're talking about the non-Jewish slave, and he is, he's a non-Jewish slave, and we have laws about him. What are the laws? The law is that he's only allowed to work for 6 years, and the 7th year, you got to let him go free. Now, does this bother you if you heard? So does something sound wrong? Does anything sound wrong about this? Let's say we're talking about a non-Jewish slave. Everything seems to fit well, right? Non-Jewish slave, no big deal. The Jewish slave, it can't be because he's going to steal and he has no money to pay back. No, talking about a non-Jewish slave. Non-Jewish slave, yeah, he works for you 6 years, 7th year, he goes free. Okay, that's what now, new explanation of Mishpatim, that we're talking about a guy who's a slave. You got to let him go free at the 7th year. Sounds good? Everything seems fine, right? Except for the fact that on a simple level, right. So Ezra's asking Rashi's question from Leviticus. But the only thing is, we didn't learn Leviticus yet. This is for a child. Rashi is explaining for a child who's studying the Chumash. So he doesn't know Leviticus yet. So as I mentioned, what is Rashi bringing a verse from Leviticus? So the thing is that Rashi's bringing a verse really because this question bothers us even without the actual verse. Rashi brings a verse because that's the source. But there's something that should be bothering us from the past portions of the Torah, from something that happened in the previous portions of the Torah, that the verse of V'his nachaltem is a source for that story, but there's some story in the Torah that seems to contradict this law. There is some slave that we know was a slave for more than 6 years. Who had a slave in the Torah? Did anyone have a non-Jewish slave?
Abraham.
Avraham.
Eliezer?
Avram had a slave. Eliezer. He was an Eved Canaan. He was a non-Jewish slave, and Avraham said, "How can he inherit my stuff? I want a child." And this was in the bris bein habesorim, in the covenant that God made with Avraham between the parts, 30 years before Isaac was born. So how long did this slave last with Avraham? Well, he lasted until Avraham was ready, until Yitzchak was ready to get married. So he started 30 years before the birth of Yitzchak, and then Yitzchak got married at the age of 40. So we're talking about a slave that was with him for 70 years.
70 years.
But our Torah portion, we want to say it's talking about a non-Jewish slave. Non-Jewish slave, it says you can only have for 6 years. What about Abraham's slave? He had Eliezer. And what's the source? The source of that is in Leviticus, there's a verse that says it, but not that you have to know that source. Rashi's really bothered with the story of Abraham. That's what's bothering Rashi. Happens to be the source of it is from Leviticus. So Rashi brings the verse in Leviticus. And Rashi says, what am I going to do? So the answer is, you know what? There's an answer. We're talking about a non-Jewish slave. A non-Jewish slave, you got to let go of, you have to free after 6 years. But that's when you buy him from a Jew. When you buy him from a non-Jew, you can keep him for a long time. That's the answer. You bought him from a non-Jew. Who did Abraham buy Eliezer from? He didn't buy him from a Jew. Who was a Jew in Abraham's time? So no big deal. He bought him from a non. He could keep him for as long as he wants. You buy a non-Jewish slave from a Jew, 6 years. So now we have a good explanation that the Chumash is talking about a non-Jewish slave. But Rashi ends off and says, you know what? That would fit very well with everything, but we can't translate it that way because Rashi concludes, he says, we're talking about Achicha ha'ivri, your brother, the Jew. And therefore it has to be talking about a Jewish slave. Right. Back to question number one is why is the Torah mentioning here the story of the Eved, the slave who is a Jewish slave and that doesn't belong here? How could we be talking about a Jewish slave? So we're back to number one. I can't answer you, Ben. I'm so sorry. We have no time left.
Oh, okay.
And so maybe afterwards, but I'm really stuck for time.
Okay.
So now we basically just got back to square number one. So we're talking about a Jewish slave now because Rashi brings a source. It has to be talking about a Jewish slave. He has a verse that says if a Jew is sold to you, and that's what we're talking about here. And he works for you for 6 years. And so we're not talking about a non-Jewish slave. So now we're going to conclude that a non-Jewish slave, doesn't matter who you bought him from, him you keep forever. A Jewish slave, 6 years, he works for you. Why are we talking about a Jewish slave over here? Over here, we're dealing with people who have no reason to steal and have no reason. Of course, they have money to pay back. So why are we mentioning it? On this, it says, ki sikna, when you will buy a Jewish slave. Rashi begins with the ki sikna, when you will buy a Jewish slave, because he's talking about in the future. We're talking about a future story. Why are we talking about a future story when we could be talking about things that are practical now? Ki sikna emphasizes the idea that we are talking about the eternity of Torah, as Ezra and Ben both mentioned, that we're talking about the eternity of Torah. The question is, but why? Why should we talk about the eternity? And the answer is because we are emphasizing here the connection between the law, the fact that at Har Sinai, we were given these laws of not to steal, not to sell yourself as a slave to anyone but Hashem. We are Hashem's slave. And by the laws of this is a case where we see clearly that the punishment is because we didn't listen, not listening. What is the punishment here of this slave, which is emphasized when he doesn't want to get rid of he wants to stay a slave, which shows that he's not unhappy with his situation. He wants to continue his situation. He's happy where he is. And here the Torah says, wow, not only did you sin, not only did you steal, not only did you sell yourself as a slave or allow yourself to cause yourself to be sold as a slave, but you want to continue like this? You want to stay a slave? Now you get your ear pierced because you didn't listen to my teaching at Sinai. You didn't listen to the fact that I emphasized not to steal, and I emphasize you're my slave and no one else's slave. So here the practical law of what we heard at Sinai comes to application. In other words, we're seeing how it applies in a very real state, in a situation where a person is going to have their ear pierced if they don't follow it, because they should be listening to everything that we heard at Sinai. And so this situation is a situation where it leads from the story at Sinai, it leads to a direct type of punishment from not following those laws. In other words, this is not a simple law where you didn't listen, you get lashes. You didn't listen, you get the death penalty. You didn't listen, you have to pay a fine. Here we have a law that is commensurate with what you did. You didn't listen to Hashem, your ear gets pierced. It's a direct consequence of not following the 10 commandments. And that's why it's mentioned here. And that's why we are talking about a Jewish slave, even though it's not so practical, but it is the consequence of the 10 commandments. Now, the Rebbe concludes with a very interesting point. He says that really in Hasidic teachings, it emphasizes that every Jew has different levels to how they serve Hashem. And there's a level of being a non-Jewish slave in our service to Hashem. There's a level of being a Jewish slave. And then there's a level of being a Jewish maidservant. And the non-Jewish slave is the first level. Non-Jewish slave means you force yourself, just like a slave doesn't have enjoyment in what they do. They just are forced to do what they need to. That's a non-Jewish slave. When we do mitzvahs without our passion and enjoyment, we just do them because we have to do them. Then you have the idea of a Jewish slave where our spiritual side, it starts affecting our animalistic side, and it becomes, the animalistic side of us is turned on to want to continue to want to do the mitzvahs. So we're still not on a level of tzaddik maybe, but we are, our Jewish soul has affected our animalistic side of us, and it has created a level of more than they just doing mitzvahs out of force, but doing mitzvahs with love. And then you have the level of the maidservant. The maidservant is serving Hashem with a much greater level of spiritual awareness, and where the spiritual side affects the animalistic side of us, and it becomes holy. And that's why the maidservant actually marries the master of the house. Why does she marry? Because she has turned herself over so much that her animal side has become, her animal soul, her animalistic desires have been turned over for holiness, have been transformed into holiness, and she can even marry the master of the house. She marries him or his son. She's already connected to the spirituality, to the world of spirituality. She has transformed herself, and that is the full application of applying the laws of the 10 commandments into our physical self and making the world, bringing the revelation at Sinai into the world, making the world a place of Hashem, where Hashem's revelation will be revealed, Hashem's glory will be revealed. I'm sorry for taking up a few extra minutes of your time. And if anyone wants to ask any